In this session, we're going to look at the evidential problem of evil and suffering. The evidential problem of evil and suffering. The evidential problem of evil attacks the existence of God in a different way. We looked at the logical problem of evil and recognized that it doesn't actually show that God doesn't exist. It doesn't show that it's irrational and inconsistent to believe in God. Alvin Plantinga showed that. Alvin Plantinga has also worked on this evidential problem of evil. Now, this problem of evil is logically weaker, but it admits Plantinga's critique, but takes another route. So in other words, it's trying to say that it's not sensible to believe in God, but not on the basis of logic, but rather this is an argument against the existence of God based on the evidence. That's the evidential problem. That in other words, given the amount of evil and suffering in the world, the probability of God's existence is so low that it should be dismissed. That's the evidential problem of evil. Is that as we look at the problems of evil and suffering, all the different suffering in the world, all the different forms that evil takes, as we look at this, the sheer amount of evil and suffering in the world, according to the evidential problem of evil, makes the possibility of God's existence so low that it should be dismissed. Now, I want to unpack three key problems with the evidential argument against God's existence on the basis of the problem of evil and suffering. Three key problems. Here's the first one. The first one of these is the incalculability of evil. Now, notice this one, it deals in probabilities. It deals in amounts of evil. But exactly how do you measure evil? What do you do to measure evil? Is there an evil-o-meter out there somewhere that we can get to actually measure the amount of evil? How much does one evil count? And how do you assess that? And how do you turn that into a probability? Can you really calculate evil? And at what point does the evil and the suffering get to be so great, so much of it, that it actually begins to diminish the probability of God's existence? And how do you assess the probability of God's existence anyway? The incalculability of these things makes this a weak argument because you really can't calculate evil and suffering. This is not something you can actually assess at a level that you can say it makes something probable or improbable. So the first problem with the evidential problem of evil, this evidential argument against God based on the reality of evil and suffering, is the incalculability of evil. Here's the second one. The second problem with it is a failure to include all of the relevant data. Let's suppose for a moment that I said, when I count all the hours of the day, when I can't see the sun, there's a lot of hours that I can't see the sun. In fact, let's just suppose that I lived in Alaska or northern England, Scotland, somewhere up in there. Let's suppose that I lived there. And in the winter, I started to calculate the number of hours that I could actually see the sun. Let's say, wow, there is a lot of dark and not very much light. In fact, I think based on being in December in Alaska, I'm going to come to the conclusion that there's no sun at all, because it seems like all the way around the clock that I don't see the sun. Well, you would respond to such an argument that there is no sun because there is so much dark. You've got to take into account the rest of the data. You've got to take into account the data from other parts of the world, not just from one part where it's particularly dark at particular times. You've got to also, you just can't only count the dark hours, you've got to count the daylight hours. You've got to take into account the entirety of the year, in which in June in Alaska, you may have 24 hours of daylight. You've got to take into account more than the narrow slice of time and space in which the sun does not show its face at all from our human perspective in particular places. Now, what does this have to do with the evidential problem of evil? It has to do with the fact that it is only counting the evil and the suffering, but it's not counting the pleasure, the beauty, and the joy. And that would be equivalent to saying, all I'm going to count are the dark hours and the dark places, and I'm going to conclude on that basis there is no sun, and not count the pleasure and the beauty, the joy, not count the sunlight times. Think of something like cancer that is a terrible, horrible thing. But far more people don't get cancer than do. Think about orphans around the world. Think about the fact of the lives that many of them, the miserable, awful lives that many orphans live around the world. But far more children have living, caring parents than don't. Think about the awfulness of a famine that takes thousands of people's lives. But also consider the fact that most of the world is not in a famine at any given time. Now, in saying these things, I am not downplaying the awfulness of any of these. All these things I've described are terrible things, terrible tragedies, ones which should cause compassion to well up within us and should cause us a determination within us to see these things changed to the full degree that we're able. But my point is this: we can't only count the dark and the negative and the awful things. We have to recognize that we have to look at all the data. We can't choose only the data that confirms what we're trying to prove. And here's the thing: we recognize these things as awful precisely because they are exceptions to what is typical. They're exceptions. There is far more pleasure and beauty and joy in the world than there is evil, suffering, and injustice and awfulness. And the evidential problem of evil says we're just going to count the awful stuff. We're just going to count the bad things. And once we count up all the bad things, then, my goodness, the existence of God seems to be pretty low probability if we count all the bad stuff. Yeah, if only you count the bad stuff. I would even argue at that point that it doesn't necessarily make the existence of God as improbable as they think. But even if we grant that for a moment, if you count only the evil, yeah, it's going to cause it to look like, at least, the probability of God might be less than you would think. But when you count all the beauty and pleasure and goodness and joy and peace in the world, I would contend that the darkness is just a speck in the light, and that there is all of that ought to be taken into account in such a formula as they are proposing in the evidential problem of evil, to try to suggest that it is implausible that there's a God on the basis of the evil in the world. But there's also a third reason that this argument against the existence of God on the basis of the problem of evil and suffering doesn't work. And it's a failure to distinguish between low probability and irrationality. The evidential problem of evil, this evidential argument against God on the basis of the problem of evil and suffering, it fails to distinguish between low probability and irrationality. Now, I'm going to grant for a moment, I don't agree with what I'm getting ready to grant, but I'm going to grant for a moment that the probability of God's existence is extremely low. Okay? Let's just grant that for a moment. I don't think it is, but I'm going to grant that for a moment. Even if that's true, it does not follow that it is unreasonable to believe in God. Well, let's think about it. Let's do a survey of people who have watched Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Maybe you've seen the movie, maybe you haven't. Let's survey all the people who have seen Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And let's recognize that 9 out of 10 people who have seen that movie cannot stand the creature, the character, Jar Jar Binks. And that's probably pretty close to accurate. That 9 out of 10 people who have seen Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, cannot stand Jar Jar Binks. And so, what that means practically is the probability of meeting anybody who likes Jar Jar Binks is extremely low. Extremely low. 1 out of every 10 people likes Jar Jar Binks. It's probably less than that, but this is an easier way to do the numbers. 1 out of every 10. However, It doesn't mean it's irrational to believe that anyone likes Jar Jar Binks, especially if you have additional information. You see, just because only 1 out of every 10 people likes Jar Jar Binks doesn't mean it's irrational to say anyone believes and likes Jar Jar Binks, especially if you have additional information. Just suppose for a moment that I know somebody who I know has terrible taste in movies. Or maybe they're 5 years old. Or maybe they're wearing a Jar Jar Binks fan club t-shirt. That I find out those things, that gives me additional information that even though it's low probability that anybody likes Jar Jar Binks, that because of that information, I have good reason to believe somebody likes Jar Jar Binks, even if it's a low probability. You see, even if a likelihood is low for something, you may have very good reasons to believe it's true based on other information. Let's apply it to something historical. At D-Day, June 6, 1944, the chance of an Allied success, the chance of the Allies breaking through the German line and being able to make the D-Day invasion effective and worth the cost, the chance of that was very low. But that doesn't mean it didn't or couldn't happen, especially based on other information we have about that event. And when it comes to the existence of God and this evidential argument against the existence of God on the basis of the problem of evil and suffering, for that reason, that evidential argument doesn't work. Because even if we granted that this person making the argument is right, that the likelihood of God's existence is very, very, very low, based on the amount of evil and suffering in the world, even if we grant that, it still doesn't make it unreasonable or irrational or even something that is improbable in the sense of someone that we shouldn't believe this. We shouldn't believe in God. Why? Because there's other information we have access to. And if we have information that suggests that there is a God, and we do, everything from the arguments from design, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, all the way over to the events in history, particularly and supremely the resurrection of Jesus, we have other reasons to think there might be a God. Then, something that is improbable, the improbability becomes irrelevant. And so the evidential argument against the existence of God on the basis of the problem of evil and suffering simply doesn't work. It doesn't work. Now, in the next session, we're going to look at the existential problem of evil, especially looking at the book of Job. And that existential problem of evil in the next session is actually the one that you will face most often as a pastor, as a church leader, as a teacher, as a parent. That's the one you're actually going to face most often. So as we go into that next session, I want you to have in your mind a framework that I'm going to give you in this session. Thinking about 4 different Old Testament books that actually deal at some level with the problem of evil. One of those books is the book of Proverbs. And in the Proverbs, what we find is there's a general trend in the Proverbs, the book of Proverbs, that if you do good, good will result. And if you do evil, evil will result. That's just a general kind of principle that seems to be woven through most of the Proverbs. That's one perspective on the problem of evil. Now, that doesn't contradict the other perspectives. It doesn't contradict the other perspectives because proverbs are not promises. In other words, a proverb, by the very nature of what a proverb is something that in essence says, this is the way things usually work. It's not saying this is the way they always work. But Proverbs gives one perspective on the problem of evil. The book of Lamentations gives another perspective, and it is that evil and suffering don't happen proportionately. They don't happen proportionately. There are people who seem like they are the good people, and they suffer horribly. And that same horrible suffering comes to people who seem like they deserve it. It doesn't happen proportionately. And in Lamentations, then the only hope is to look forward to God's future salvation, which in Lamentations is a hope for a return to the land, a hope for a return of the people of Israel and Judah to the land that God had given them where they had once lived. That's what we find in Lamentations. It's disproportionate. There's only a future hope. In the book of Ecclesiastes, we find yet another angle on this, which is that you can't make sense of any of it. You can't make sense of the problem of evil. You can't make sense out of the existence of evil. You can't make sense even out of pleasure or work or anything if you think only under the sun, which is Ecclesiastes' way of describing life without reference to any transcendent God. Life without reference to a God who is beyond us. It's life under this. Says you can't make sense of it under the sun. You can't make sense of your pleasure. You can't make sense of your pain under the sun. And the fourth book, is the one we're going to look at in the next session, which is the book of Job, in which you have a book in which Job's friends have almost taken the book of Proverbs as promises. And so as they see Job suffering, they conclude that Job must be unrighteous because after all, if you do good, you get good. If you do evil, you get evil. You've got evil. Therefore, you must be unrighteous, unjust. But Job, he's agreeing with the book of Lamentations. He's agreeing with that type of an idea of suffering isn't proportionate. But Job asks, what do I do now? Is there a future hope? Yes. Job has some hints of future hope. But he says, what do I do now in this life? And Job is in essence asking the mentality of the book of Ecclesiastes, about under the sun. Job is saying, how can we know what God is doing beyond the sun? Job is fine with what Ecclesiastes says. He's fine with this reality that you have that you can't make sense of life under the sun without reference to a transcendent God. Job gets that. But he asks, how do I know what God's doing beyond the sun? How can I know what God's plan is when I'm in the midst of pain and suffering? And that's the richness of the book of Job. Now, we don't know exactly when all of these books were written. When I say they're in dialogue with each other, I don't mean that they were all written at the same time. It could be that hundreds of years separate some of these. And in fact, I think some of them are separated in that way. But I'm talking about the ideas in each one. Proverbs, you do good, you get good. Lamentations, evil and suffering, they don't seem to fall proportionately where we think they would fall. Ecclesiastes, you can't make sense of life unless you look beyond the sun to some transcendent reality. And Job, in this richness and beauty, it seems to interact with all these different perspectives and asks, God, what do I do in time of suffering? God, will you answer me in time of suffering? And that's what we're going to look at in the next session on the existential problem of evil.